Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel about decolonizing the machine, race, gender, disability, robots, computation, and art. The authors, Christina Schoux, Boris Abramovic, Suhun Lee, sorry, I'm going to present very badly your name, I'm very sorry, Budhaditya, Chattophadyay. Budhaditya, like that. Yes. So very different from, sorry. I learned something new. So this panel explored the Black feminist critique of post-human in through artistic practice and performance. Sorry. The panel explored Black feminist critique of post-human in through artistic practices and performance research that utilize robots, machine learning, and computation. We uncover the veiled link between racial, gendered, and ableist practices, and to combat the governing codes that construct and continue to normalize practices of dehumanizing exclusion. This panel is one of the more critical contributions we received at IZEA 2022, and I was very excited to listen to your conversation, and I'm sorry we can have all the remote panelists with us, but I think it's going to be a great presentation, and I think there will be a great interaction with the public. So, please.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Good afternoon, everyone. We are pleased to have a panel discussion, Decolonizing the Machine, Race, Gender, Disability, Robots, Computation, and Art. We are a group of artists, researchers, and scholars from diverse fields, including performing arts, media art, robotics, artificial intelligence, curation, and social sciences, who have come together at a conference stream entitled Decolonizing the Machine at Politics of the Machine last year. To give a brief introduction of the Politics of Machine conference, it questions how the machine and technology impact and contextualize artistic and cultural production and our perception of the world, and aims at investigating the histories, theories, and practices of machines and technologies in between and beyond disciplines. I would like to thank both the IZEA Organizing Committee and Politics of Machine organizers / the directors who have constituted this paper together. Christina, Marco, Elizabeth, Grisha, Boris, and all, who are actually joining us remotely somewhere, for granting us the opportunity to share our works and thoughts. So this panel has two key questions in mind, and then we will present what we have actually presented at Politics of Machines and the kind of thoughts that we have developed through time. So the key two questions are, what are the impacts of algorithmic bias and encoded discrimination in the context of machine vision algorithms, natural language processing, and robotic embodiments as they relate to gender, race, and disability? The second question would be, how might artistic practice and rogue research methods challenge, refute, disrupt, blow up the dehumanizing practices that are encoded into machines? Those two questions sounds very bold, and we are very happy to tackle these questions through our presentations. Our thinking and framing is informed by Sylvia Winter, Margaret Sheldrake, Alexandra Vilhayes, Habius Viscus, Louis Chide-Soquet's The Sound of Culture, Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, Sophia Noble's Algorithmic of Oppression, Jennifer Rees' The Robotic Imaginary, and so on. We critically inquire into issues of race, gender, and disability as they relate to performing machines, technological bodies in robot and cyborg art. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Suhun Lee. I'm a media art curator and researcher interested in the subjectivities of the bodies, how they are encoded and decoded, reproduced and consumed algorithmically within the media ecology and visual culture. Well, currently I'm working at Art Center Nabi based in Seoul, and my curatorial practice includes examining the socio-cultural discourse of new media art utilizing AI, robotics, and NFT, aiming to shed a light on the meaning of humanity within current technological advances. I will briefly introduce the panel members. Joining us digitally are Jessica Rajko and Stacy Schoux. Jessica is an assistant professor at Wayne State University in dance and big data/analytics. As an interdisciplinary scholar and practitioner, she applies critical feminist approaches to research at the intersection of somatically informed dance and human-computer interaction design. Artistically, this includes the design of intimate haptic sonic data representation of datasets about people toward critically investigating the data aesthetics. Stacy, who will be also joining us through video, is a postdoctoral fellow in interaction design at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. She works on themes of disability justice and equitable technologies. Specifically, she explores how theories from critical disability studies can offer frameworks to critically interrogate inequity in data-driven technologies and to imagine more just alternatives. Budhaditya is a sound and media artist joining here at the podium. He's a sound artist, media artist, composer, and researcher, and he's currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Arts and Humanities, American University of Beirut. Focusing on sound as his primary medium, Budhaditya produces works for large-scale installation and live performances, broadly dealing with the contemporary social and political issues such as the climate crisis, human intervention in the environment and ecology, race and migration. And here we have Boris, who was part of the Politics of Machine organizing committee, and you would like to introduce yourself a bit?
Thanks, Suhun. Thanks for the introduction. I am a researcher in personal robotics at University of Vienna, combining in my work art robotics with social robotics currently. But importantly, a few words about the Decolonizing, a machine research platform and its founders. Elizabeth Jochum is Associate Professor of Art and Robotics and leads the Research Laboratory for Art and Technology, RELATE, at Aalborg University in Denmark. Her research bridges visual and performing arts with engineering and human-robot interaction. She's a guest editor of Frontiers in Art of Human-Robot Interaction, Creative Perspectives from Design and the Arts, and she coordinates EU strategic research project of artificial biology, robotics, and art. Christina, Schoux, Associate Professor of English Linguistics and Head of the Languages and Linguistics Research Group at Aalborg University in Denmark. Her research focuses on language, race and sexuality, critical linguistics and ethics of technology, New Orleans Englishness and media studies. Artist Marco Donnarumma, performer and scholar weaving together contemporary performance, new media art and computer music since the early 2000s. Marco has a PhD from Goldsmiths, and his research and writings embrace performance studies, body theory, and critical disability studies. Grisha Coleman, time-based artist working in performance and experimental technology, Associate Professor of Movement, Computation and Digital Media in the School of Arts, Media and Engineering at Arizona State University. So the founders of the Decolonizing the Machine Research Group, which launched this initiative for Politics of Machine in Berlin and embraced researchers from the field, some of which we will have an opportunity to hear further through our panel. Thanks Suhun, thanks Budhaditya, and you wanted to present the first presentation within this research group.
Sure. I'm pretty sure you might be wondering who are all this number of people just being introduced at. We actually have them online, and we hope to have them linked to our conversation later. But before we go on to that, we would like to have four of the presenters, Budhaditya, May, Stacy, and Jessica, and we will play those of the panelists online through the video. So the first one is by Jessica Rajko.
Confederacy, which was granted to the United States.
Sorry, could we hook that up to the video, please? Hi, could we have some help with switching the screen, please?
One second, please.
It's the neoliberalism's body video. Sorry.
Duplicate pantalla.
Yeah, it's in Korean.
Preference.
Preference.
Okay.
That's function.
No, function. Sorry.
Back.
Tag. Is duplicate.
Duplicate.
Duplicate is.
Mirroring. Okay. Lovely. Now, like this. Thank you.
United States in 1807 through the Treaty of Detroit.
So our first panelist is Jessica Rajko, and she'll be presenting Techno-Neoliberalism's Body, Dancer, Labor in Computing Research and Race as Always Already Additive.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor to be here with a collective of artists, researchers, and scholars organized together today. My name is Jessica Rajko, and I am coming to you from Wawiyatanong, also referred to as Detroit, the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was granted to the United States in 1807 through the Treaty of Detroit. Today, I'm going to summarize research affiliated with the forthcoming publication supported through the Politics of the Machine Conference, discussing dance practices and their involvement in computing and engineering research. My presentation is inspired by my literature review of ACM Digital Library papers involving dance and dancers, and I will be narrativizing this alongside an analysis of Boston Dynamics' popular holiday video depicting the virtuosity of their robots through dance, which is where I'll jump right in. At the end of 2020, robotics company Boston Dynamics released a video of their robot models dancing to Do You Love Me by the Contours. This video quickly went viral, generating a flurry of social media conversation, which stirred up a range of critical questions about the ways in which dance is operationalized, both within the video itself and more broadly across computing and engineering sectors. Despite covering many topics, active discussants somehow landed on dancer attribution as the most pertinent issue to address. Notably, when IEEE Spectrum editor Evan Ackerman acknowledged that Monica Thomas was a choreographer affiliated with the project alongside a small group of other dancers who remain unnamed. We could look at this as a minor win for dance. However, it is worth questioning how a complex conversation about power dynamics landed on the named attribution of a single choreographer as a solution. Naming Monica Thomas reflects a common tokenistic gesture often used by large paternalistic institutions when they celebrate or name a marginalized stakeholder to evade critique. However, the gesture of naming Monica Thomas also reflects common dancer attribution practices within the area of dance most commonly engaged in computing and engineering research. That area of the field is contemporary Euro-American concert dance with practices rooted in postmodern choreographic methods. For example, dancer, scholar, and artist Jose Reynoso explores the popularization of adding the phrases "and dancers" or "with dancers" to a choreographer's name when giving choreographic credit in a program or review. Until recently, these gestures have gone largely unquestioned and even lauded as a function of progressive ethics. But as Reynoso points out, such gestures reproduce rather than subvert neoliberal logic. And this becomes a particular problem when we wish to look at issues such as race, racism, and colonization. Returning to the Boston Dynamics video, for example, I can identify several African-American social dances that elevate the popularity of the video. Robots exclusively use well-known fad dances deriving from African-American social dance, including the twist, the mashed potato, and the hungry caterpillar, also more commonly known as the running man. However, there is no individual who represents African-American dance affiliated with the Boston Dynamics project. And in fact, such individualized representation fundamentally runs counter to the embodied philosophies of Black movement vernacular. By hiring and not naming Monica Thomas as a choreographer, Boston Dynamics effectively subverts any potential critique of their use of Black movement vernacular by delivering Monica Thomas's name upon request and highlighting this as the progressive gesture towards which dance as a field is honored. Scholars Allison Reed and Amanda Phillips describe these actions as additive race, or that which reduces race to a matter of style. As Reed and Phillips describe, the deracination of Black aesthetics tends to reduce Blackness to that which can be aesthetically labeled as hip or cool. Once deracinated, Black aesthetics are then integrated into digital design as general aesthetic features, mostly as a means to cash in on their broad popularity. Such practices disregard the fact that Black aesthetics are rooted in the embodied experiences of what it means to be Black. The general indifference to the fact that Black aesthetics derive from embodied experience indicates a dominant cultural assumption of a racially normative, transparently white core subjectivity. Moving into the space of embodiment also troubles a reliance upon vision as proof to identify discriminatory practices. To my point, I found 7 papers in my corpus research referring to the design of interactive media engaging club dance for broad movement, enjoyment, exercise, and consumption. As I've already somewhat discussed, club dance here is another way of saying derivatives of Black social dance. None of the papers include dancers at any stage of the research process and depict their products as largely for learning and entertainment. One paper goes as far as to describe the social dance setting of clubs, the social dance club setting with the following disclaimer. Unlike many other activities, there seems to be no real purpose to dancing. The interaction itself seems to be pointless, end quote. In these contexts, the historical and geocultural roots of club dance and their connectivity to Black communities are so far removed from the discourse that it can be difficult to see the ways in which colonization is functioning here, particularly when no representatives of club dance culture are acknowledged to matter or even exist. Again, this is not dissimilar from Boston Dynamics' treatment of Black social dance vernacular within its holiday videos. Here I've begun to identify how specific cultural practices in building capital and Euro-American concert dance impacts how Black embodied philosophies are deracinated within computing research. As I continue to build upon this work, I plan to study how these socio-political practices inform and are informed by dance studio and research lab culture. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Stacy Schoux. She's also joining us online, and her presentation is on reconsidering discourses of inclusion in assistive AI.
Hello everyone, I'm Stacy, and I'm here to talk about AI for accessibility, but not in the traditional sense of how do we design technology that removes accessibility barriers. Instead, I'm interested in taking a step back and asking, what ideas about normalcy make these barriers visible in the first place? So when we read stories about AI and accessibility, we typically see stuff like this. These are smart glasses that use AI to make visual information accessible for blind or visually impaired people. It can read the back of a cereal box, it can describe objects and people in a room. It's great because it allows blind people to navigate everyday tasks independently without others' help. Now, this plays into a deficit narrative where disability is seen as posing a problem. It creates friction against normal ideas about able-bodiedness, and this friction should be smoothed out. often through glossy new tech. Talks of accessibility and inclusion are dominated by this framing. Scholars call this inclusionism, which refers to practices that fit disabled bodies into already existing boxes. In other words, as disability scholar Amy Hamray notes, accessibility is used as a tool for normalization. It reifies how normal bodies should look, maintaining the status quo. In her book, On Being Included, Sarah Ahmed critiques these integration practices, saying, a fantasy of inclusion is a technique of exclusion. It obscures as much as it reveals. So what's being obscured as a result of this narrative? Disability culture. Recall the AI foresight example. It presumes independence as the main goal of accessibility, when in fact, most blind or visually impaired people rely on guide dogs or sight guides. They embrace a culture of interdependence, recognizing that it takes community and collective work to achieve access. The narrative of inclusion also obscures its profit-driven underbelly. The smart glasses, for example, sell for $3,500 US. Disability is an emerging $8 trillion market, and as far as the market is concerned, it's a problem that requires product-based interventions. Here's a stair-climbing wheelchair from Topchair. It's engineering feat, and it seems to offer a neat solution to an access problem. That's disability activist Liz Jackson says. If you actually talk to disabled people, they will tell you that it scares them, that they can't afford it, and that they simply don't want it. What they want is access. They want ramps, they want elevators. The solutions to many access problems preferred by disabled people are often low cost, simple, sometimes even one-off. Countering inclusionism, critical disability theorists propose a more radical project. They call into question the very terms of inclusion. The goal is to challenge the cultural logics of ableism and to reorient existing standards to center disability as a way of knowing the world. I will discuss two projects by disabled artists that engage with disability as both a generative and critical tool for reimagining access. Jenny Seeley is a deaf British theater director. Her production of Reasons to be Cheerful is an example of her method called the aesthetics of access. Rather than approaching access as something to be squared off after a piece is finished, she uses access as a creative starting point that drives the entire creation process. For this production, the audio describer for the visually impaired audience is turned into a sharp-tongued character called Pickles, who provides cheeky commentaries. And the live captions for hard of hearing individuals are worked directly into prompts the characters interact with, doing away with caption boxes altogether, which is often placed far from the center of the action. These access considerations open up new dramatic possibilities. She transforms accessibility into a critical element of her art. Anti-Stairs Club Lounge is an installation by artist Shannon Finnegan. It's a lounge area on the ground floor of an art exhibition space. Some artworks are shown on the ground floor, but most of them are shown upstairs. However, there's no ramp or elevator access, so it creates an unequal exhibition experience for disabled people. What Finnegan does is she creates a room on the ground floor and fills it with amenities like reading materials, drinks, and candies. To get access to this lounge, you have to sign a form that says you won't go upstairs. So this lounge becomes exclusively for people who are staying on the ground floor. It reverses the direction of exclusivity, centering disabled rather than non-disabled people. It also serves as provocation, creating conversations around what access means more generally. These artists approach access from the perspective that disability itself is a valuable way of being. Mia Minga says, access for the sake of access is not necessarily liberatory, but access for the sake of connection, justice, community, love, and liberation is. I believe we can do access in liberatory ways that aren't just about inclusion, diversity, and equality, but are rather in service of justice, liberation, and interdependence. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. If Suhun would agree, we can proceed with her presentation. Is that what we would be up to?
We would both present in person, and I'll go now. Today I'm going to scale down the research presented at POM, Racial Data in Identity Construction of Intelligent Agents, to revisit the importance of racial data, how it is used in forming subjectivities of AIs, especially in the case of embodied AIs, and its implications in media aesthetics and histories through looking at two of the artworks, Conversations with Bina 48 by Stephanie Dinkins and Mythic Being by Martin Sims. To briefly let you know what I mean by racial data, it is data on race and ethnicity, often a type of demographic information that is classified with a limited set of categories. It works as the designated structure to categorize one's subjectivities in visual, oral, and textual forms, such as the color of their flesh or body, the language they use, etc. Thus, the racial data and physical realization of racial data become the core of AI's subjectivities, which cannot be detached from social implications, bias, and stereotypes. With the majority of developers, engineers, and entrepreneurs in the field of science and technology being grouped to put forward presumably white and standard robots, the interface of AI, the physicality of AIs and their language can be used as a technology, challenging the social inequities and technical restrictions, also as the tool to calibrate the character and the identity of AIs. Conversations with Bina 48 and Mythic Beings stand amongst the proliferation of embodied AIs as notable pieces to rethink race as well as systematize subjectivities for virtual identity construction of embodied AIs. Conversations with Bina 48 is a series of conversations including Bina 48's monologue. Bina 48 is an emulated humanoid of an African-American entrepreneur, Bina Rothblit, created by Hanson Robotics, a group of researchers and scientists in America. And it is capable of voice and facial recognition, which enables it to make conversation verbally with people. It is the set of Bina 48's speech acts, carefully selected by Dinkins, that constitute her character, apart from her looks that have been cast from Bina Rothblit. Mythic Being, presented and developed through a number of shows, is a mixed media installation that features the character Mythic Being, a personified threat model of the artist Martin Sims. A programmed chatbot called Teeny is created through feeding hours of her personal responses that were loaded to interact with the audience through text messaging. I did a semantic analysis of both works to show how it is paramount that not only documenting narratives of the lived experience in the form of audiovisual digital media, but the interaction they have with the audience reinforce systematic subjectivities. It is through conversations Dinkins have with Bina 48 and the chats viewer could have with Mythic Being that the audience perceives and accedes to the recognition of their embodied AI's subjectivities and identities. It is in use that the conversations Dinkins had with Bina 48 and the interaction viewers had for Mythic Being are what shapes their digital identities. Mirroring the value system of contemporary society, both works engage in sharing the lived experiences of the artist, but also acknowledging its presence, consequently giving a critical glance into the future virtual identity construction of embodied AIs and their interaction. So to conclude, subjectivities of embodied AI mirror the social bias and prejudices, holding possibilities of restructuring and repeating them digitally. Racial data in the symbolic form of subjectivity could also be used as technology to construct the virtual identities from which social recognition could also be obtained. The subjectivities of embodied AI work as a fluid and flexible container of desire to be recognized, consequently acknowledged and valid as a valid experience in contemporary society for the marginalized and the colored. Definition of racial data in constructing identities of embodied AI thus should be expanded to visual, oral, and textual data of race that constitute embodied AIs, as well as the interaction encoded into the data itself when analyzing media works using embodied AIs. I would like to wrap up my presentation with a quote by Wendy Huikyung-chun, which I hope to discuss further on. Race be not simply an object of representation and portrayal of knowledge or truth, but also technique that one uses, even as one is used by it. A carefully crafted, historically inflected system of tools of mediation or of inframing that builds history and identity. Would love to talk more about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suhun. Thanks, everyone. The next short and final short presentation from Budhaditya, Connecting Resonances on Pre-Modern Indigenous Sound Technologies.
We can go to the next slide. Yeah. The invocation of the pre-modern as a binary of the modern has been widely criticized as modernity's representation of its other. It has been shown by decolonial scholars like David Mosse and Esha Shah how the agency ascribed to the idea of the pre-modern or traditional, or what is termed indigenous, is not only founded on a binary opposition of the modern, but also embedded in the particular forms of imagination of the nostalgic past and the lived present, and putting in place a power structure in which modernist technologies are posed as saviors of the world, hence far from being historically accurate. A temporal demarcation of using the prefix pre before modern suggests that modernity starts somewhere like a liberating bang. Everything else prior was primitive. This is a colonial perspective of upholding the Western dominance and supremacy. On the contrary, traditional practices and modernist technologies such as recording, sound, motion picture camera, photography, later radio, have had a mutually influencing impact, often through cultural violence, but nonetheless have historically got entangled, coalescing and adjusting to each other, rather than having a binary and temporally linear relationship. If we study trajectories of media technologies in South Asia, there is indeed a mutating influence of modernist technologies like sound recording. But this colonial intervention also made contexts in which inter- and cross-cultural confluences took place and hybrid forms of aesthetic expressions emerged. In the realm of sound practice, recording technology was a Western modernist invasion in South Asia with a mutating effect on the traditional indigenous technologies and pre-colonial sound instruments such as Rudraveena in the slide. I have discussed, presented in a paper earlier yesterday, how there are resistances of traditional practitioners of sound in South Asia against the modernist recording technologies the colonial companies wanted to impose on, such as shellac discs, 3-minute-long recordings of atemporal live performance. When it comes to making a taxonomy and nomenclature of what is termed media arts and tech arts, one may ponder over the archaeology of what is understood as technology, which is often a Western concept of linear progression and in essence a colonial tool of plunder. As we know from history, how technology was imposed and employed to objectify and exploit the resources of the Global South. If we take a historical perspective, in South Asia, the transfer and transmission of modernist technologies took place as a colonialist and imperialist strategy of control, quantify, and exploit the resources, as I said, South Asia, Africa, Middle East, and the Latin Americas, which are known as the Global South. In South Asia alone, advent of such modernist technologies happened through colonial models of erasure and taking over control, benefiting the imperial powers. Early Western colonial technologies, such as recording, are part of this narrative. Global North's condescending approach towards the colonized South didn't allow much equal distribution of power, knowledge, and aesthetic understanding. However, South Asia and the Global South has been the house of some oldest and time-tested technological and cultural practices in visual, haptic, and sonic realms, as well as in urban design, water management, and agriculture. There was no reason to make a hierarchy of knowledge and culture if we listen to some of the pre-colonial aesthetic practices where a pre-modernization concept of technology existed. And which was as intricate as its global counterparts. In the slides, you can see the basic structure and the construction of Rudrovina, an instrument made with traditional tuning systems, which is an example of what I'm trying to argue here. The examples include, as I mentioned earlier, musical instruments such as Rudrovina, gongs, ghungroos, traditional wind chimes in South Asia, temple bells, tuned with traditional methods, among others. These instruments are usually performed within certain rituals. If we unpack the intricacy with which sound-producing instruments were conceived and built in South Asia, using indigenous technologies of tuning and instrument design, we find out that the pre-modern indigenous sound technologies were as sophisticated as the technology we know today from Western modernist and colonialist understanding of it. Therefore, it makes no sense to adhere to the hierarchy of high-tech and low-tech, considering pre-modern as primitive and define tech art from a Western taxonomy, represented often by the large-scale immersive media arts proliferated in European and American tech art festivals, such as Arts Electronica. Given the rich examples of artistic practices using pre-colonial technologies in South Asia alone, I propose to redefine what tech art is and decolonize the term to give long due credits to the tech artists and artisans from the Global South. Thank you.
Thanks, Budhaditya. Thanks, everyone.
So now we will start the panel discussion, and so we kind of hacked the system. So we have the rest of the panelists on Zoom, and they can't really see us, but then they could hear us, and it would be great if we could take questions from the audience and from all of us to each one of us. And if you guys have questions for those who weren't here, they could hear us, and then they will probably respond within the chat, and I'll read it out loud. If you guys have any questions, please do ask.
We do have a question. Thanks for raising your hand, and please.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. So I have a question for Suhun. So thank you very much for what you showed us, and I would like to hear more about your opinion, if you could elaborate a bit more about AI concerning race, concerning the use of race. What do you think about that, your critics?
So today I wanted to talk about racial data, not about AI or whether we would have like general AI that would rule the world. I wanted to like get down into segments of it, what constitutes those kind of AIs, and define what kind of racial data we could look into. So when looking at those two artworks, we instantly perceive the different skin color, and I thought it's almost the same with machine vision, and to artificial intelligence, there are so many different fields, as in NLP, GAN, or vision. So it's very similar to our perceptive organs, and then they are coded to reflect on our senses, and naturally, so it reflects our biases and stereotypes. So when I wanted to say racial data about conversations with Bina 48 and Mythic Being, the racial data is not only the textual data that has been fed into the embodied AI, but the kind of physicality that it carried, and also the kind of interaction that they had with the audience. For instance, as the audience look at their work, they would initially know that they're of different race, or they carry specific type of racial information, and that is embedded within their interaction and conversation as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi, excuse me, can you remind me your name, please? Yeah?
Budhaditya.
Budhaditya. I had a question for you in relation to, I've given also a lot of thought about the relation between, or the possibilities of decolonizing technological approaches, mostly more from South America. And I've been finding that there's always this inherent contradiction or difficulty when talking strictly about content creation, but yet still using the tools like computers, devices, sensors that are produced with the extraction of minerals from the global south. So I find that sometimes when we talk about a decolonial use of technologies, we're not really looking at the larger picture of where these devices and technologies come from, how are they produced. So I was wondering if you had an idea of how to approach this apparent contradiction of speaking about the decolonial use of colonial digital technologies.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, the genesis of technological innovations are coming from the Western modernist understanding of it. And often it happens that technologies are appropriated and hacked to localize. Often it happens that the native users of technologies, they appropriate the different context of the technology, such as, for example, if I take an example of sound recording, the early sound recordings were fixed registration on 3 minutes long discs. When that was the direct recording on the disc itself, shellac discs. But magnetic recording opened up the temporal limitation of 3 minutes, and the musicians who resisted recording on the shellac discs, they found the magnetic recording as something they could hack into. For example, joining the tapes for longer recordings on live performances. So that is one way to understand how technology can be localized through appropriation and hacking. I hope that responds to your question.
Hello. I have a question for Budhaditya, but if somebody else have this, a thought about this question, it's totally welcome. And I have these questions in a long time, and I've been like trying to crack this. So do you think it's possible to form a decolonial practice of political in technological and also politics, tactics, when the majority of the practitioners, the majority of the also developers are white settlers? Does that have to do with the subjectivity of who is developing that, who is behind? But yeah, so this is open for anyone who wants to answer.
So just to clarify your question, I'm so sorry, could you summarize your question in one sentence so I could type it down and also read from their responses as well?
Yeah. Do you think it's possible to form decolonial practices on political and technological tactics from coming from white settlers, right? In this case, it can be developers, it can be political leaders, yeah.
Sure, Budhaditya, do you want to answer the first or?
Perhaps you could answer.
Yeah, to answer your question from my perspective and my presentation, that was actually literally the point that I wanted to point out with the racial data of who is creating the data, who is formulating the data, who's spreading the data, and who is using the data. So I couldn't go on and on about presenting the difference between mythic being and conversations with conversations with Bina 48, as there are very different embodied AIs, and the kind of racial data they used are very, very different. So for instance, Bina 48 is constructed by a group of heterosexual white male scientists and engineers who have put together most of the data that circulate around the kind of online platforms that we are very much familiar to. In contrast to Bina 48, mythic being, the teenie, runs only through within the artist's data of her personal accounts, personal memoirs, and of course the kind of language they use is very, very different. And to go on with your question of how we could decolonize the practice, the artistic practices they're using different kind of artificial intelligence algorithms would definitely, I think it applies on how the technology is being more and more accessible, and how we are more open to accepted kind of narratives. For instances, when I was using this, when I was researching for the study, I was desperate to find East Asian artists using AI to talk about their stories, to use their face. But we have a very different narratives because this kind of decolonial discourse is exempt in a place where colonization did not happen or does not happen, or when you don't feel like the minority in your country. For instance, the kind of artists that I've encountered using AI models, they don't have to talk about post-colonial discourses because we are majority in our country. So we only get to be the other when we go on to become the minority. And I think this kind of complicates the kind of layers and then the narratives that we could talk about within the data we are producing, the models that we are producing, and how it all circulates through our platforms.
Yeah, I take your question and adding to what I've said in response to your question, I'd like to understand whether there are different strands of inquiry. For example, if we think about how the colonialist deployment of technology were turned upside down, we need to understand that these different strands of inquiry. For example, I locate three strands. One is temporality, one is spatiality, and one is subjectivity. In temporality, the kind of temporality imagined by the colonial technologies and the producer of them were not considered enough about other temporalities. For example, classical forms of sound performance like Drupal or South Asian sound performances, which are temporarily more expansive and extended form of performance. If we think about spatiality, often the way microphones were produced, they are focused on a directional way of recording an object, like a shotgun. And so the shotgun, for example, were made into multi-channel Brahma microphones, for example. So that way, available technological devices were appropriated to find another form of temporality, another form of spatiality, which are more localized.
Yes, and if you guys have more questions, please to ask, and then the others are formulating their replies online.
And we can, in this case, we can also repeat the question so that Elizabeth and Christina and others would hear it, because I'm not sure if they can hear. Oh, you're going to type it. Okay, that's great. Do we have a question?
Can we get the audio from the Zoom presenters? We cannot do now. That's a very precarious situation.
Okay, so we have the answers, we have the responses from Jessica. To respond to the question, I think we have to consider what we imagine, what we mean by technology, and what we perceive as within and outside of this framework. Dance is a technology in her context. That was from Jessica. And from Marco, a short answer. First, acknowledge colonial practices, desert those practices, and exit the idea of technological progress. Any follow-up questions or comments?
Thank you for that. I work at an NGO that does co-design of tools with indigenous communities, and all these questions are amazing because they are very hard to do and we consistently challenge. And so for me, what is interesting is in doing like the field work and the training is I think that a lot of these themes of accessibility are disassociated from, racial dynamics, cultural needs, and historical context, intergenerational trauma, erasure, and part of me is asking, how do we find frameworks for coming up with processes that actually engage in a cross, I guess, aware way that, like vision problems in the jungle are a real thing. I have to train people. They don't have access to glasses. Things are designed for certain types of physical limitations or cultural relevances that may or may not make sense. And so I'm wondering if anyone has come across practices or prompts that help them address some of these intersectional ways of reaching or tapping into who they hope to connect with.
I want to ask you a small question as to, are you asking that, are we looking into universal approach towards encompassing everyone, or are we breaking down into different narratives and different communities of people? Because I believe the approach will differ it will vary based on the communities, the people, the kind of context they come from, the kind of narratives they want to build in. And I think it's a really hard question to answer in that sense to satisfy everyone, because AI is not a panacea, nor it could ever be a panacea. But I think it's our attempt to actually go deeper down into fragmentizing different usage of algorithm models, and then try to have more quantity of the data that we could actually circulate around and then use, actually, because the kind of data we are accessible to are very limited at the moment. And I believe certain quantity of data should be accessible of, I couldn't say everyone, but for everyone. Any thoughts? Oh, I'm actually curious for the detail. Is there any examples of using music as such type of connecting nodes between the contemporary and the past?
I wanted to show a video because of the technical difficulties we face here. We couldn't organize, but I sent you just in the email. If you can download it quickly, we can play a small clip.
Is it a new presentation video?
Yeah, I sent you in the email just 5 minutes ago.
Okay, whilst I download that, would you like to answer the question?
You can play the video.
So perhaps we can play the video as our last few minutes, because we are approaching the hour that we had, thanks to Isia and Susanna and everyone else for this hour.
Whilst we download the video, anyone else would like to jump into this discussion? I actually have the question back to you, as I wanted to hear more about the kind of research and practices that you do as well, because I think that tunes in very well with the kind of presentations that we had and the discussions that we're trying to have. Would you like to share a little bit more about it?
Yeah, thank you. Our org is quite small, and the intention was never to develop tools. It was always to take open source tools that existed, adapt them, link them together, and find a workflow that communities could use in order to get the information that they wanted to make the strategic political actions that they needed to make, whether it was a legal case, whether it was reporting spills, reporting metrics on impacts in their territory. And after years of inadequate open source hacking that were essentially inaccessible to communities because they were not hackers, they were hunters, and they're working in their land and they're focusing on their daily life, we made the choice to start developing a tool and co-developing. And so it was very hyper-localized, decentralized, offline tools, focusing on really simple UI at the time to satisfy the needs. And we're in this interesting part where, word got around. We get asked all the time, like, oh, that group did that thing for that case. We want to do the same thing. We're facing the same threats, spills, mining, blogging. And so we get asked more and more. And so now we have like the not-for-profit industrial complex and funding complications saying we have to scale up. We want this tool accessible to everyone. And as an organization, we want it to a degree, because then we face this conflict of universality versus creating a tool that is precisely effective for particular needs. And so it's like an org. We're at a point where we have to make a decision about how the development of this tool will go and what scale means and what impact means. And these are really just open questions at this point.
I think those are the questions for everyone who's actually working in the sector, like be that commercial or non-commercial. I think those are like the critical questions to ask. Thank you very much. And we have the video.
Yeah, just before we start the video, just want to contextualize the video within the discourse of decolonization, the way we understand it from the decolonial theorists such as Walter Mignolo or Rolando Vasquez, the question of reparation and question of reciprocity, how we can recognize the contributions made by Global South artisans and ways of listening, ways of instrument building, ways of tuning, ways of seeing, and how we can actually develop a conversation with the pre-modern, with the hyper-modern. And in my project, I wanted to bridge this divide titled Dhoni. It's an installation presented at the III, curated by III River Festival 2021, The Hague. The title of the work is Dhoni. It is a self-regulating, alive, autonomous sound and sculptural installation which is drawing idea from the biomimic networks such as spider web. In this spider web, there are different nodes, and each node has a temple bell. These temple bells, they have a background. They are used in worshipping, ritual and traditional purposes in temples. So I take them as a ritual element, but open it up for further discourse around network, interconnectivity, codependence, and make the ritual more playful using an AI machine learning model and 4 robotic arms. It is deliberate that we give the machine an agency to act on its own behalf, to think, listen, and act, so that it's outside of the human control. So how the system will behave, we don't know. The ML code is trained with incidental sound in the room, and those incidental sounds include human movements such as clapping, speaking, footsteps, also the white noise in the room, ambient sound. And the AI is classifying those audio information through the training in different parameters. It's acting on them, responding to each parameter with a note.
Thanks, Budhaditya. Thanks everyone for being with us today. Thanks again to ICEA and to Decolonizing the Machine group members. Some of us couldn't be here with us today. Thanks to Elizabeth Jochum, Christina Schoux, Marco Donnarumma, and to everyone who contributed to this panel and to this research initiative, which for sure and which certainly continues further, and with the possibility to meet up next year for ICEA.